Welcome to the Lenny and Maria Sanchez NotebookLMvideos.com overview show. All right, today we are going to be jumping into some pretty provocative ideas. We're talking about stuff that really challenges what most of us think we know about our own health, global politics, and even some really famous historical mysteries. So yeah, let's just dive right in. So here's the game plan. We're going to kick things off by looking at some alternative takes on heart disease that, well, they definitely go against the grain. Then we'll get into this fascinating system inside our own bodies that kind of pulls the strings on our behavior. After that, we're going to tackle a very controversial argument about human evolution. Then we shift gears to global politics, and we'll wrap it all up with a wild theory about one of history's biggest unsolved mysteries. All right, first section, we're diving headfirst into some alternative health debates, and we're going to re-examine what we've been told about blood pressure and heart disease.
Okay, so this first source really lays out two totally different ways of looking at high blood pressure. On one hand, you've got the mainstream view, which basically says high blood pressure is the disease. You hit 130/80 and boom, you get a prescription. But then you have this biological terrain perspective. And this view says, hold on a second. High blood pressure isn't the problem itself, it's a symptom. It's your body's way of adapting to a messed up internal environment. Think toxins, a bad diet, that kind of thing. So instead of just throwing drugs at the number, the idea here is to fix the underlying cause. And the source actually points out that a lot of people who switch to something like a carnivore diet see their blood pressure just sort itself out.
Okay, now let's get specific. Another source lays out a really interesting theory for how plaque actually builds up in our arteries, atherosclerosis. It's basically a 5-step chain reaction. So step 1, you eat a lot of linoleic acid, which is everywhere in seed oils. Step 2, that unstable fat gets packed into your LDL particles. Because it's so unstable, step 3 is that this LDL gets damaged or oxidized really easily. Now here's the twist. Your body's cleanup crew, these cells called macrophages, they see this oxidized LDL and go into overdrive trying to clean it up. That's step 4. They eat so much of it, they turn into these things called foam cells. And the final step? These bloated foam cells get stuck in your artery walls, and that's what builds up into plaque. And this quote right here from Steinberg and Whittam really gets to the heart of the matter. What they're saying is, maybe we're focusing on the wrong thing. It's not just about how many LDL particles you have, it's about what's inside them. When they're stuffed with this vast excess of unstable fats, your body's natural defense system, its antioxidants, just can't keep up. It creates this huge imbalance, and that's what makes the LDL so easy to damage. According to this theory, that's the real starting point for heart disease. All right, let's pivot a bit. We're moving from heart disease to a really fundamental system in our bodies that's all about energy and motivation. We're talking about the endocannabinoid system. So when we think about our body systems, we usually think about them keeping things stable right now, right? That's homeostasis. But this source argues that the endocannabinoid system is different. It calls it an exostatic system, which is a fancy way of saying it's always thinking about the future. It's designed to get you to do things now that will help you survive later. And the perfect example they give is hunger. Let's say you haven't eaten in a while. This system fires up, and suddenly your sense of smell gets way better. Food smells amazing. That's not an accident. It's your body motivating you to get up and find food for future survival. It's a really ancient, deep-seated drive. And here is where it all ties together with our modern diet. Remember those omega-6 fats from seed oils we were just talking about? Well, it turns out those are the exact building blocks our bodies use to make these endocannabinoids. So the theory here is pretty compelling. Because our diets are just flooded with omega-6, we might be sending this ancient eat-for-the-future system into overdrive. It's like our body is getting a constant screaming signal to store fat and prepare for a famine. A famine that, for most of us, is never going to come.
Okay, we're shifting gears now to our next topic, and I want to be very clear up front. This is a highly controversial subject, drawn from a source in the UN's review. What we're going to do here is simply present the arguments laid out by the author, David Skrbina, in his case for what he calls artificial selection or eugenics.
The author's entire case is built around this one central provocative question: has our success actually become our biggest problem? His argument is that our greatest triumphs, especially in modern medicine, have had a massive, unintended side effect. He claims that by ensuring almost every child survives to adulthood, we've effectively switched off natural selection. And the result, in his view, are so-called dysgenic effects, a slow but steady decline in humanity's overall genetic health. So, let's look at the timeline the author presents to make his case. He argues that for literally millions of years, about half of all children didn't survive long enough to have kids of their own. This, he says, was nature acting as a filter, pruning out genes that didn't work so well. But then, just about 100 years ago, everything changed. In the developed world, child mortality just plummeted to almost zero. And his conclusion from this is pretty stark. He argues that now, all genes, the good, the bad, the neutral, get passed on, leading to what he calls an accumulation of mutations in the human gene pool. And to make the point that these ideas aren't some new, radical invention, the author brings in historical figures. He points to this quote from Plato's Republic, for instance, to suggest that the concept of selective breeding has been on the table for a long, long time, discussed by some of Western civilization's most foundational thinkers. So, based on that entire premise, the author then lays out 4 principles he believes would be the foundation for a eugenics program. The first is that having children should be seen as a privilege, not a right. The second is a direct rejection of the principle that all humans are created equal. His third point is that such a program would work best within ethnically homogeneous societies. And the fourth and final principle is that the best individuals have the highest obligation to reproduce for the good of the community.
Okay, we're making a big jump now, away from biology and into the world of geopolitics. In this section, we're looking at some very real shifts in global power, drawing from a few sources that are analyzing new trade blocs and some really high-stakes international summits.
Now, take a look at these numbers, which come from an article by Hua Ben. They seem to tell a pretty clear story about a global realignment. The argument here is that we're watching 2 major trade blocs emerge. You see China's trade with partners like the ASEAN countries and Africa just skyrocketing, up 9%, 12%. And at the same time, its trade with the United States has dropped by a massive 20%. The takeaway from this source is pretty clear. A China-centric economic bloc is growing and getting stronger, while its ties to the West are fraying.
Now, shifting to a recent summit in Alaska, we get this quote reported by the Exposé. It's attributed to Donald Trump, and it really sums up his perspective on the situation in Ukraine. He's essentially making a realpolitik argument, saying Ukraine should make a deal because, as he puts it, Russia is a very big power and they're not. It's a view that prioritizes a negotiated settlement based on the raw power dynamics at play.
But, as you can imagine, that approach is not going over well with everyone. Far from it. We have a European diplomat flatly stating that legally recognizing Russian land grabs cannot happen. Period. Another source even describes the scene as a clown car of panicked European officials trying to get in on the meetings. And then, bringing it right down to the ground level, you have this incredibly powerful quote from a Ukrainian soldier who says it feels like they are trading our lives for their politics. So yeah, some deep, deep divisions there. And for our last topic today, we're heading into some really fascinating and I have to say, very speculative territory. We're going to reopen the case file on one of the greatest, most enduring mysteries in the entire history of exploration. Okay, get ready for this. The source for this is an article by an author named Miles Mathis, and he doesn't beat around the bush. His central claim is just stunning. He argues that the legendary climber George Mallory never actually died on Everest back in 1924. Instead, he claims Mallory faked his own death. So, how does he try to back this up? Well, one of his key pieces of evidence is this divorce decree from 1927. See, the official story has always been that Mallory's climbing partner, Andrew Irvine, was straight, and they point to an affair he had. But the author says this document blows that story up. It apparently shows that the woman involved divorced her own husband for cheating, not the other way around. So the author's theory is that the whole affair story was just a fabrication, a cover, to hide what he claims was the real relationship, that Mallory and Irvine were lovers. And it doesn't stop there. The author piles on what he calls a bunch of other red flags. For instance, the only witness who supposedly saw them high up on the mountain was a cousin who apparently changed his story multiple times. Then there's the weird detail of Mallory using precious porters to send back seemingly pointless notes. And maybe most tellingly, Mallory's will apparently only accounted for a tiny fraction of his actual wealth. The author pulls all these threads together to argue for one single motive. Mallory staged his disappearance to escape persecution for being gay in 1920s Britain, so he could run away and live with Irvine in secret.
So, from challenging ideas about health and diet, to deeply controversial theories on society, to global power shifts, and finally historical conspiracies, we have covered a lot of ground today. And every single source has, in its own way, pushed back against the mainstream story. Which kind of leaves us with this big lingering question, doesn't it? In a world that's just drowning in conflicting narratives and competing versions of the truth, how on earth do we figure out what's actually real? Thank you for listening to another session of the Lenny and Maria Sanchez Video Overview Show, produced and archived at the website notebooklmvideos.com.